last week we have hosted a meeting by a Italian Buddhist monk. Her name was the Anna Maria Signor Maladi. And today we invited Reverend Thomas Kirchner. So I think these events has a very special meaning for this Nanzan Institute. So we are now, this year we are celebrating the 5th anniversary of Nanzan Institute. So we have 3 themes. One is the intercultural philosophy. The second is translation and publication. This is responsible for that. And the third one is interreligious dialogue. I think these 3 themes are the main pillars of this Nanzan Institute. So I'm very happy and by honored and privileged that today we can invite the Kirchner for give a talk. So let me just briefly introduce you today's lecturer. He was born in 1949 in America and came to Japan in 1969. And for a long, long time, he has studied first in Waseda University and then studied someplace in grad school. And also he spent many years for the meditation in Shofuku-ji in Kobe, Kencho-ji in Kamakura, and Kennin-ji in Kyoto, etc., etc. So, and also while he practiced meditation, he published many books. For example, I wrote here the Entangling Vines, and also the Dialogues in a Dream. He makes dialogue even in a dream. So this is the translation of the Mucho Mondo, the very famous Zen text. And also he wrote a Japanese book, Zen Natta Amerikajin, Thomas Kirchner no Hanseki. So here you can find many pictures in his as a child and his adolescent. So I think he has published many books and he tried to understand Zen. Today he will talk about that, try to understand Zen from the Christian perspective or to understand Christianity from this Zen perspective. So he has given us 2 kind of manuscripts. So we'll send it to our colleagues on Zoom. But please understand these manuscripts are intended to help us understand today's talk. So just for that aim, please read this text. So today our schedule is so. We have first have 60 minutes for Reverend Kirchner's talk, and then we have 10 minutes short break. And then after that break, we will go further for the discussion among us. So before we listen to Kirchner's talk, please let me ask you, we want to invite all of you to the dinner after today's talk. So may I ask you, raise your hand when you can join us?
We go to Hamayu supper.
We go to join us to dinner. 9人ですが、はい。だから from the 7:30 in the Hamayu, the Chinese restaurant. So, okay. Thank you so much. So I do not want to lose many times. So we want to ask the Kirchner his talk, please.
Okay. Okay. Good evening or afternoon. Evening, I guess already. First of all, congratulations to everyone at the Institute on your 50th anniversary. Yeah. And also, I would like to thank you for inviting me to speak this evening. As Kim Sensei explained, people here have 2 different papers. What happened was when I was asked to do this talk, I decided to base the talk on a talk that I gave first a number of years ago at a German Protestant seminary. Actually, it was a dormitory associated with Heidelberg University. And they assigned me this theme of what can Zen learn from Christianity, which kind of surprised me because generally when I've been asked to talk, it's the other way around. What can Zen teach Christianity? But I found I was a little surprised, and I wondered what I was going to talk about. But anyway, I found it a very, very interesting subject, and I would like to discuss, the major points that I raised at that time. Was that that particular group is not terribly familiar with Zen. This is the original talk based on that talk that I gave in Germany. That particular group was a group of theology students, so they were not extremely informed about Zen. So I devoted like the first 4 or 5 pages to sort of explaining the many different varieties of Zen, how Zen is not one tradition. But anyway, try to give people a bit of context for the talk and what, if we're talking about what Christianity might have to offer to Zen, what particular aspect of Zen would it address? Anyway, I took up a number of issues. But as I thought about this evening's presentation, as you mentioned, you have these three themes that the Institute has basically devoted its energies toward over the past 50 years. And you wanted me to address the theme of interreligious dialogue. And looking back on my own life, I would say there are 2 major aspects of the dialogue that I have been directly involved in. One is the East-West spiritual exchange, Tozai Reisei Koryu in Japanese. This was a dialogue. I'm going to go into a little bit of more detail about this when I get into the paper itself. And not so much an interreligious dialogue, but more precisely an intermonastic dialogue. Talks between the monastics on the Zen side and on the Christian side. So I thought instead of introducing Zen, I'm sure this audience knows a lot more Zen than, ordinary theology students in Germany would have known. So maybe it would be of greater interest to you, I thought, if I talked about a little bit more about the East-West spiritual exchange as I experienced it, and also what the present status is. So I'll start with that. And then in the second half of the paper, or the second 2/3 of the paper, I would like to go back to what I described earlier. And some of the main issues were, I think, a knowledge of Christianity, various issues in Christian, or more specifically, those Christian traditions that have a monastic tradition. So Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. What certain major themes in these traditions might have to offer the spirituality of Zen Buddhism, the contemplative tradition in Buddhism. What I will do from this point on, this would be basically on page 2 of the second. There's one with a title on it. This is the old one. The one without the title is the new one. Starting from page 2, I know that the fastest way to kill a talk is to read it, but I'm covering so many issues here that more or less compelled to read. I'll try to read it in a way and at least will infuse it with a bit of life. But without further ado, let me start out with a description of the East-West spiritual exchange. Okay, the East-West spiritual change, as I just mentioned, is an intermonastic exchange program between the Zen monasteries of Japan. As it worked out, this was primarily the Rinzai tradition Zen monasteries, and the Catholic Benedictine monasteries in Europe. So Benedictine, the whole range, not just strictly speaking Benedictines, but of course the Trappists, the Comaldalese tradition. I've been involved in this program since the 1990s. I believe when a large group came in the maybe even late 80s or early 90s, I was asked to do interpretation. And then in 2003, I was a participant and stayed for a time at the Camaldolese Hermitage in the mountains of Italy. Also, in addition, I think the history and present situation of this program tells us much about where the Buddhist-Christian dialogue as a whole stands today. And I regret to say this is, I think, rather in a state of steady decline. The East-West Spiritual Exchange began in 1978 when nearly 50 Japanese Buddhist monks and nuns stayed for a month-long period of practice at various Catholic monasteries in Europe. Since then, I think this was followed, I believe, 4 years later by an equally large group of Catholic monastics and also priests, I think other religious that came to Japan and similarly spent fairly extended 2 or 3 weeks in Japanese, primarily Rinzai Zen monasteries. Also, particularly the women were going to the Soto Monastery here in Nagoya. The intermonastic dialogue, I should add that the exchange has continued generally at 2, depending on circumstances, 2, 3, or 4-year intervals where a group of Catholic monastics will come to Japan, and then 2, 3 years later, a group of Japanese monastics will go to Europe. The intermonastic dialogue has sometimes been criticized as being something of a one-way street, with Christianity seeking what Zen has to offer and Zen more or less willingly responding to this outreach. I think it simplifies a rather complex situation, but to a large extent, I would have to agree with that. But I think there are good reasons for this. And I also don't want this characterization, of a kind of a one-way street to mean that it was only really actively engaged in by the Catholics. I think that, there was a kind of great deal of interest in the Christian monastic traditions shown by the Zen monastics that were involved in it. Some of them were quite influenced by it, I think. For example, one example I can think of is Hozumi Sensei, a Japanese Zen master who I think participated in the first of the exchanges back in 1978 and was so inspired that he continued going to Europe until he reached the age of 85, just 3 years ago, teaching at the Catholic monasteries to groups that were primarily composed of Catholics who were interested in the meditative traditions of Zen. So anyway, I saw a lot of, genuine collegiality in these exchanges. So in that sense, not really one way. It was very much participated, I think, sincerely by both sides. Again, as I see it, the main reason for the apparent one-sided nature of the exchange was that the East-West Spiritual Exchange, at least as I understand it, was largely initiated from the Christian side by Catholic priests and monastics in both Japan and Europe who had a deep interest in the practice of Zen meditation. But this was not all that rare at that time. Some of these priests and monastics had even become recognized Zen teachers. So they included individuals like the Jesuits Kakichi Kadawaki, who was at Jochi, I think, at that time, and Enomiya Lassalle. I'm not sure how active Enomiya Lassalle was in the actual exchange, but I know that he was very influential on the people that were involved in it. Also, on the European side, people like the Benedictine Father Pierre de Bethune at Clairlande in Belgium. Also, additional support. There was quite a large community of Catholic priests and monastics, sisters, who were actively involved in Zen meditation under Yamada Koun Roshi in Kamakura at the Sambo Kyodan. What's the name of that zendo? It doesn't come to mind. A lot of these people are still quite active, actually. Have returned to their own countries and are teaching Zen groups that are composed not only of ordinary, American and European Zen practitioners, but also people who still are associated with the Catholic Church, but are interested in meditation in that tradition. Also, Jim Heisek just mentioned to me that Father Jan van Braft, the head of the Institute at the time, was quite involved in the foundation of this entire project. So a lot of connections with Nanzan here. This interest in Zen meditation among Catholic priests and monastics was in good part rooted in the similarity as seen, by the Catholic clerics that were involved in the program. Part rooted in the similarity between the early meditation practices of Christianity, meditation practices that were largely lost to the Catholic Church during the Counter-Reformation. Both Zen meditation and the early Christian meditation practices involve emptying the mind of images in the understanding that limited human thought being, it's conditioned mind activity. It can never access the unconditioned reality of the divine. So it's only through a process of emptying, kenosis in Christianity, that we can start to bring our mind more into accord with the absolute. Zen meditation, and this is a factor I think that was of particular interest to the Catholic meditators at the time. Zen meditation has been very much deepened by the Asian understanding of the role of the body, of posture, of breathing, physical relaxation, for example. The big role that the body can play in the spiritual life, particularly in the practice of meditation. I mean, if we want a mind that is relaxed and open to the present moment, it helps greatly if we have a body that is relaxed and open. I think especially in the first few decades of its existence, the East-West spiritual exchange played, a quite active and vital role in the intermonastic dialogue between Zen and Christian Catholic monasticism. Let's see here. I think, as I mentioned, to some extent this continues, but recently in particular, looking back on the program as a whole, going on for almost good 40 years now, maybe a little bit more. It seems to me to have been the product of a quite unusual period in the history of Catholic monasticism. Most of the Catholic monastics and priests I know who have been active in this exchange entered their religious orders during the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s and the 70s, around that time. And this was a time when monasticism, I think, was still certainly comparative, but in real terms as well, still quite active and vital in the West. The large monasteries like, Otiliens? These places had like 200 monks. Now, I just actually was just in Belgium to do a retreat with a Catholic group there. And the venue that we used for the retreat was the pronunciation Shimoi, the famous beer making monastery. I think this is another monastery that had over 100 monks, probably. Huge buildings. Now they have about 14, I think, 13 or 14 monks. Yeah, it was They're quite rich because they make beer, and they're using their wealth wisely to support other monasteries that, you know, that are not as well off financially as Shimei is. But at any rate, as an active monastery, it's just nothing near what it used to be. At any rate, things were different back then. And some of the active participants, as I mentioned, were people like, I think primarily Father Pierre de Bitoune, a Belgian Benedictine. I think he's been perhaps the most important force in the continuation of the East-West spiritual exchange. I wrote a rather brief summary of how he got involved. Maybe I can fill this out a little bit from things I heard of him. I don't know how public he wants some of this information, but I found it very intriguing. When Father Bitoune entered the Benedictine order, apparently he was not all that interested in meditation. He told me that he was sent to the Belgian Congo at the time. And I think all of you, a lot of you here know him. You know, he's full of energy, full of ideas, of projects to carry out. And he carried all of this ambition with him to his mission in the Belgian Congo. But apparently his superior was quite satisfied with the way things were. And one time when Pierre de Bitoune came back from, I think they get a 3-month home leave period, the old missionaries. And when he came back from one of those visits to Belgium, his possessions were packed and waiting for him outside of his room in the monastery in the Congo. So he had to return to Belgium. And he told me he was quite despondent for a while. But his abbot in Belgium, who was a quite understanding soul, said to him, you know, Pierre, why don't you take some time in Rome? Just, you know, I think a change of scenery would be good for you. So Pierre de Bitoune went to Rome and always open to new activities. He started studying the tea ceremony with Michiko Noji, very active, energetic Japanese teacher of the tea in Rome. And one of her ideas was that a very, very important part of the Japanese tea ceremony spirit is Zen Buddhism. So she had organized at least one a year, I'm not sure. She was organizing week-long Zen meditation retreats with the Zen master Suzuki Sochu. And Father Pierre de Bitoune attended one of these, and he just, something about the meditation really clicked with him. And he was so inspired by his experience through this retreat that he got permission from his superiors to come here to Japan for almost a half a year. And he spent this time at the monastery Ryutakuji in Mishima. And again, the monastic life, the practice, I mean, he was so inspired by this that he said, look, you know, it changed his entire vocation. I mean, he felt that, you know, this was the path for him. He felt that every monastic should have the opportunity to at least find out about meditation. So he was, you know, he has been a driving force in the exchange, the intermonastic exchange, ever since then. He is always the one who's gotten in touch with us here in Japan. Let's do another one. And he has kept the pressure on the Zen side. You know, the Zen people have always been very willing to cooperate, but they've never been the initiators. And it is thanks to Pierre Bitoune that it has continued as long as it has. Now, another person who I think is very indicative of the sort of people that were keeping this program going is a Trappist friend of mine named Jeff Boekmans. Not quite as active as Father Pierre de Bitune, but he's a type, I think, that has been very active in the sort of endeavor to introduce people to Zen meditation in the Catholic orders. Apparently, he told me, he said he had a very profound spiritual experience when he was a young man. And it inspired him to go into a religious vocation. This was like, I don't know, maybe over 50 years ago now. And, you know, if he was going to go into the monastery, he wanted to be strict. So he decided on the Trappists. So he entered the Trappists. But he still couldn't really make sense of this experience he had until one day, Father Enomia Lassalle came and gave a talk at the monastery. Now, Father Enomia Lassalle, I'm sure a number of you are familiar with him, but from very early on, I think even prior to World War II, in order to better understand the sort of the Japanese spirit, he felt it would be very educational. At least a good way to understand more deeply into the Japanese mind would be to start Zen meditation. And again, he started a very serious practice, and he eventually did become Zen master. But at any rate, he saw it as part of his vocation. He was not a monastic, he was a Jesuit, but he saw it as part of his vocation to go back. I met him actually back in 1971. And he struck me as a very deeply grounded, deeply practiced person. And, you know, very, very humble as well, as the impression that I got of him. I think it's largely, in good part, maybe I could say, to his influence that the church became willing to allow this initiative to sort of take off. At any rate, he gave this talk at the Trappist monastery in Zundert in the southern part of the Netherlands, and Jeff was really inspired. So again, his abbot at the time was also very interested in meditation, Zen meditation, I think. So he gave Jeff permission actually to come to Japan a few times. He started studying with the Sambo Kyodan tradition, which is a lay tradition of Buddhism. And he too has become a teacher of Buddhism, a teacher of Zen meditation. He started because apparently at this time the monastery was quite supportive, again, with the original abbot, and he was allowed to hold Zen retreats at the monastery once a month. 30 people, that was the limit that he could teach. But there was every retreat was filled. And so many people wanted to attend the retreats that he was he received permission to hold another retreat outside of the monastery. Every one of those was filled too. He was doing like 24 retreats a year. And as I said, everyone was filled. And as a Zen monk, I was thinking, you know, wouldn't his monastery have like noticed that and thought, maybe these people are doing something that we should pay attention to? But unfortunately, the shift was in the other direction. There was actually a sort of, well, I mean, there's probably very good reasons for this. I'll go into this. There seemed to be a decline in interest in this sort of outreach, the actual meditative. Part of this, as I said, probably very good reasons from, you know, the perspective of the church. For example, the people that started entering the monastery, the type of people that started entering the monastery were not people like Father Pierre de Bitune and Jeff Bookmans. I'm going to go into this. I think there were reasons for this, but they tended to be more conservative people that were looking for the old Catholicism and seeing the monastery as the best place to live this sort of life. So that movement in Catholic monasticism, but also not just that. I think that, as I mentioned before at the beginning, there was kind of a very special time in Catholic spirituality when these people were entering, people like Pierre de Bethune and Jeff Bookmans, in that I think people that had a real spiritual calling, people that wanted to deepen the life prayer, people who were interested in contemplation, or like Jeff Bookmans, it may not have been explicit at the time, but something was driving them in this direction. And particularly for someone who had had a Catholic upbringing, the natural answer was, well, I'll go to the monastery. I mean, there basically were no other options at that time. So people would go to the monastery and, you know, these influences at the time, like Enomia Lassalle, you know, this would get them involved in Zen or other forms of meditation. Zen influenced meditation, like centering prayer. These were quite widely practiced at the time. So that was part of it. And the other part of it, I think, is like an increase in options, is the way I put it. For example, if you wanted to do meditation, if you had this spiritual drive, how did I put it? You know, if you were looking for like a deeper meaning in life, a deeper, more contemplative, spiritual lifestyle, like I said, monasticism was kind of the only option. Nowadays, however, I mean, numerous options for a meditative life exist. You know, there is, of course, the Zen lay traditions. Every large city has, you know, numerous Zen centers, places where people can go for Zen practice. Other meditative traditions associated with Hinduism and, you know, Southeast Asian Buddhism, like Vipassana. The mindfulness movement, again, a kind of a more laicized, but nevertheless, it's just kind of a contemplative tradition. There are all of these options and possibilities for a meditative life. And they're very available. And a lot of these have kind of developed as lay traditions. So the teaching is more kind of suited to lay people. So anyway, people that are kind of interested in meditation maybe are not all that familiar with monasticism. In other words, the young versions of Father Pierre de Bethune and Jeff Bookmans now would tend to go to, I think, to these more easily available options for meditation practice. The same thing exists in Zen very much, actually. The young people that, you know, become interested in meditation, you know, 50 years ago, Zen was the only game in town. So people would become Zen monks, you know, learn meditation in the monasteries. But nowadays, again, Zen monasticism has kind of, I see a movement of almost like retreating into itself a bit. There's much less outreach to the laity than there was 50 years ago. Monks like, you know, Yamada Mumon and Shibayama Zenke and any number of monks I could mention were going out and they were giving lectures, talking to the lay people, explaining what Zen had to offer. Everyone knew about Zen 50 years ago. I would go to renew my visa. People at the immigration office would say, "Oh, you're a Zen monk. Well, you know, kabate kudasai. And, you know, here's your visa for another year." No one ever questioned this. Now, the few young friends I know, you know, from the West that go to get their visa, people at the immigration office don't even know what Zen is. I think it's some old version of Omo Shinrikyo or something, you know, and people have a very, very hard time getting a visa nowadays. So a change, you know, And the young people now are just not turning to Zen anymore. Most of them don't even, again, they don't even know that Zen monks do meditation, believe it or not. They're turning to Vipassana, other sort of more lay-oriented traditions. So anyway, for a number of reasons, you know, I think, you know, these factors not only account for the decline in the inter-monastic dialogue, but if I might venture my opinion, in the decline in monasticism as a whole. Like I said, you know, these monasteries that had 200 monks only a few decades ago, they're down to a few monks, all of them in their 70s and 80s. Father Pierre de Betune, when I visited him recently, he pointed to one of the other monks and he said, he's our most recent arrival. He is the most recent monk that came here with a vocation and is still here. And he came in 1985, 40 years ago. So this terrible kind of collapse in monasticism, I think, is part of this. Well, it's sort of maybe to, again, the lack of interest in monastic life has combined with this greater accessibility of alternative meditative traditions that do not require the monastic life. Is part of what probably this decline in monasticism as a whole. Okay, I don't want to sound too gloomy. I still have some very fruitful connections with the monastics that I know, but I think more importantly, let's see, where am I here? I think this other aspect of the dialogue, and this is what I was discussing in my earlier paper. What is it that Christianity, particularly the Christian orders that have a contemplative tradition, what do they have to offer to Western Zen students, particularly Zen students? And I think they have much of tremendous value. First of all, I pointed out in that paper, let me go back to my reading here. Buddhism has always been quite significantly influenced by the various cultures it encounters. So just as there are Chinese expressions of Zen, Korean expressions of Zen, and Japanese expressions of Zen, which, you know, differ quite significantly in my expression, in their lifestyles, certainly, there will inevitably arise distinctive Western forms of Zen, and those forms will inevitably be shaped by the predominant spiritual culture here in the West. Christianity is certainly not the only spiritual tradition here, but as the predominant tradition, it will inevitably influence the way Western Zen develops. When I ask, what might Christianity have to offer Zen? I think, first of all, it's important to keep in mind exactly what kind of tradition Zen is within Buddhism as a whole. The word Zen, deriving from the Sanskrit word dhyana, actually means meditation. Thus, when we talk about the Zen school of meditation, we are talking literally about the meditation school of Buddhism. In other words, Zen is, to put it in Christian terms, a contemplative tradition. Thus, a meaningful discussion of Christianity's possible contributions to Zen must be, I think, a discussion of Christianity's possible contributions to the Zen contemplative path, rather than, as often happens, you know, an argument that for Zen taking on more of the type of social activities that Christian groups often engage in. By Western Zen, I mean the Zen practiced in the West by people who identify themselves primarily as Buddhists, in contrast to, like, well, for example, the Zen groups that are practicing even now with Father Pierre de Betune. in contrast to people who still strongly identify with Christianity, would find Zen meditation to be a helpful part of their spiritual life. Westerners who identify themselves primarily as Buddhists are generally interested not only in the meditative practice, but are also quite interested in Buddhist thought and often look to Buddhist concepts to give structure to their religious lives. At the same time, though, many have had Christian upbringings or been significantly influenced by the Christian concepts that are part of Western culture. Often these Christian influences have been rejected at some point in their lives, but the imprint remains. It's very much the case with me. I mean, as a young man, I was very, very confused. If I had met some of the Catholics that I have met subsequently, since then, in the monasteries, my life course might have been much different. But I didn't think the Catholic Church had much to offer me. Particularly this notion, well, as I saw it again, that the only entrance to a viable spiritual life in Christianity was faith, which I interpreted to mean, I don't interpret it to mean this now, but at the time I interpreted it to mean the unquestioning belief in certain ideas and concepts. And what interested me about Zen is that they had an actual practice, which I didn't see that in Zen, in Christianity at the time. At any rate, going on, I think people throughout the world are, basically similar in their spiritual needs for forgiveness, for devotion, for transcendence. And the world religions have responded to these similar needs in accordance with the cultures they developed in. So the answers may be different, but they're addressing the same needs that we all have. For this reason, I think that the way in which Christianity or Judaism, or even the modern Western religion of psychology, have come to terms with these basic spiritual needs can be quite inspirational to Western Zen practitioners. Thus, I believe Christianity's possible contributions to Zen are not a matter of Christianity offering Zen something that Zen entirely lacks, but rather what they offer is a different approach to expressing the truths that are already common in both traditions. This can be the case for quite fundamental issues, such as the meaning of grace or the significance of suffering, and I want to discuss these in more detail later. But it can also be simply a matter of how a certain concept is expressed. For example, as in mindfulness, Zen places great emphasis on being in the present moment. I mean, you've all heard the mindfulness man, be here, be now, There is a Japanese word for this, narikiru. It's always being stressed in the Zen monastery, becoming one with what you're doing, whether it's meditation or pulling weeds or washing dishes or wherever. But I've never in Zen heard an explanation of why one should narikiru. I mean, Zen just generally does not like to express much. And, the teaching of right here, right now, I mean, what often ends up happening is that, well, the monks kind of do it, but they don't really know why they're doing it. It's kind of, there's no sort of conceptual structure behind this. Contemplative Christianity has the same teaching. I think you all are probably a little more familiar with this than I am, but I think Christianity, it puts it into a more concrete terms that, in my experience, often resonate more deeply with Westerners. In contemplative Catholic orders, this is something maybe you could tell me a little bit more about later, but in contemplative Catholic orders, they speak of a concept known as the sacrament of the present moment. This may be just Brother Lawrence, but I have heard of this from several monks, the sacrament of the present moment, a sacrament being something that brings us closer to God. For example, baptism, marriage is a sacrament. My Christian monastic friends tell me that the present moment is called a sacrament generally my Christian monastic friends are people who do Zen. So they have their own way of explaining things to me. But their way of explaining it to me was, they said the present moment is called a sacrament. In other words, something that brings us closer to God, because it is only in the present moment that the divine can manifest in our lives. The past is a creation of our memory. The future is merely our past experiences projected onto that which hasn't happened yet. So, in Catholic monasticism, being right here, right now, is regarded as the best way to give the divine the maximum opportunity to manifest in our lives. But again, now this opens up what I think is maybe the most important contribution that Christian thought can make to the practice of Zen and Zen meditation. How does the divine manifest in our lives? How does God manifest in our lives? This opens another central Christian concept that I believe has something of great importance to offer Zen followers of Buddhism. According to Christianity, the divine manifests in our lives through the workings of grace. Grace in the Christian sense is, of course, a divine act, a freely given gift of God offered to people quite separately from their own effort. So at first it might seem that Buddhism, as a non-theistic religion, would have no place for the concept of grace. I mean, who or what, after all, would be doing the giving? And Zen, I have to say that Zen as a tradition usually regarded as espousing self-power, although it doesn't really. Self-power is attributed to Zen only by the Pure Land people. It's intended as a criticism of Zen. Zen never says jitiki. But in point of fact, as I say, in point of fact, there is in Zen a real tendency to ignore this sort of grace element in spirituality, with many writings quite clearly encouraging attempts to force the experience of enlightenment through effort and strain. Now, this is not universal. And I think it may be intended just as a beginning step, but at any rate, this often leads Zen practitioners, both Western and Japanese, but maybe I think particularly Western, to misconstrue meditation as a matter of forcefully suppressing thought to generate extraordinary states of mind. I've seen that in far too many cases. This results in burnout, frustration, and eventual abandonment of meditative practice. And I speak from experience. I mean, I think I wasted years of monastic practice in precisely this kind of effort, because they don't really ever tell you. Zen wants you to find out by yourself. And in those people with a natural kind of a natural proclivity for the practice, I could say, that's, if you do discover it yourself, it may be that much deeper. But most people don't get it. This is my experience from Zen monastic life. So anyway, I myself wasted countless hours in the monastery doing precisely this kind of meditation. So I think that an openness to Christianity's message on the role of grace in the spiritual life might help Western practitioners of Zen not only avoid this danger of forcefully imposed states of meditation, but also see that the concept of grace is in many ways quite in line with Zen spirituality. For example, a very, very interesting quote I have, in Dogen. For example, there are passages in Zen writings that definitely point to what can only be identified as the concept of grace. I think the most famous one is a famous passage in the Shoji chapter of Dogen's Shobogenzo. This is what he writes, in English translation, of course. Just letting go of body and mind and forgetting them both, throw yourself into the house of Buddha.
when you allow yourself to be acted upon from the side of the Buddha, then with no strength needed and no thought expended, you are freed from birth and death and become a Buddha. Another example, kind of an intriguing example, is a short poem that the great Zen, 20th century Zen master Yamada Mumon Roshi wrote after his first spiritual awakening. This is when he was suffering from tuberculosis. And one morning he woke up and he knew he was cured. And it was kind of it was a spiritual experience for him. And he was inspired to write a poem, which in Japanese is, Oi naru mono ni idakari aru koto, kesa fuku kaze no suzusha ni shiru, which I translate as something that I am embraced by something vast. I know that by the coolness of this morning's breeze. And Yamada's Mumon Roshi's successor, Harada Shoda Roshi, has been very active in teaching Zen to Westerners, and is kind of a samurai type himself, actually. But he often says that the practice of Zen meditation, is all about what he calls makaseru. In other words, learning to surrender, or he likes the word entrust. Far from being self-power, in the sense, of the self powering itself to enlightenment, Zen can better be regarded, I believe, as the active practice of learning to let go. Although the notion of being acted upon by the side of the Buddha, in other words, basically the concept of grace, although this is not spoken of much in Zen, particularly not in Rinzai Zen, but it is in fact implied by the fundamental Mahayana teaching that enlightenment is possible only because we are in essence already enlightened through our inherent position, Buddha nature. In his essay, a very, very great essay, if any of you are interested in this issue, on Marco Paulus, the early Buddhist writer, in his essay, Is There Room for Grace in Buddhism? The great Buddhist scholar Marco Paulus argues persuasively that Buddha nature is a dynamic presence always moving toward manifestations in sentient beings. Marco Paulus was such a brilliant thinker that he ended up creating sentences that were almost impossible to follow if they're being read, but he really expresses this very well, I think, if I can read it in a comprehensible way. Let me try. The key to the problem lies in a property of transcendence itself, given the incommensurable gap between enlightenment and the seeker after enlightenment, who is ignorant by definition. It is self-evident to anyone who thinks at all that such a seeking on the part of a human being who is necessarily imperfect and limited and imperfect does not really make sense when taken at its face value. Enlightenment, or God for that matter, cannot possibly be situated at the passive pole in relation to man's endeavor. Intrinsically, enlightenment it has to be the active figure in our situation, and it is man who, for all his apparent initiative and effort, represents the passive term of the supreme adequation. Meister Eckhart puts this whole question into proper perspective when he says that, quote, in the course of nature, it is really the higher which is ever more ready to pour out its power into the lower than the lower is ready to receive it, unquote. And then Marco Paulus continues, as Eckhart goes on to say, quote, there is no dearth of God with us. What dearth there is wholly ours who make not ready to receive God's grace, unquote. And Marco Paulus says, where Eckhart says God, you have but to say enlightenment, and the result will be a Buddhist statement in form as well as content. So this is the action of grace, the unconditioned dynamic of the divine always seeking to manifest itself in the limited conditioned mind. A greater emphasis in Zen on the concept of grace, of being acted upon by the side of the Buddha. I think this might really help clarify that Zazen is a practice not of forcing the mind into extraordinary states, forcing states of imposed silence on it, but of doing our part to allow our intrinsic Buddha nature to manifest itself. My next paragraph, actually, this is something that was said to me by the abbot of the monastery, the Trappist monastery, Our Lady of Guadalupe in Oregon, who was another enthusiastic Zen monastic. He and a group, he told me, he said, how many of us Trappists, even though we're a contemplative order, how many of us actually meditate? He said, maybe 10%, which is true. I think that's true of even the Zen meditators. How many of them are actually meditating? But anyway, he and a group of the monks at the monastery that were really interested in the contemplative practices would get together an hour before the early morning services and practice Zen meditation together. They all had their little meditation cushions. But anyway, the way he put it, I asked him, what are you seeking out of Zen meditation? And he said, I'm just trying to get out of God's way, which I thought was a very interesting way of putting it. Anyway, in this sense, I mentioned I had earlier this question about this whole, the necessity of faith in Catholicism. I was very intrigued by something that the writer Alan Watts said. He made a comment on this, the relation between faith and belief. As he put it, belief, as they use the word here, is the insistence that the truth is what one would, quote unquote, leaf. In other words, truth is what one would wish it to be. Faith, on the other hand, is an unreserved opening of the mind to the truth, whatever that truth may turn out to be. Faith has no preconditions. It is a plunge into the unknown. Belief clings, but faith lets go. And I think this is really the direction that Zen meditation is trying to head. I see that I was wondering how I was going to fill up a whole hour, but already. But there's a couple other points. One, maybe I could try to cover a little more quickly. One thing I think a valuable lesson for Zen practitioners is what I call a sort of an example of validation of a purely contemplative practice. I mean, Zen doesn't need validation. It is, the meditation school of Buddhism. But I think for Westerner Zen practitioners, I see this sort of tinge of conscience somehow, that if we're not out there in the world, doing active work, then somehow the practice is incomplete. And, I think a lot of people who do meditation, they do actually have a genuine vocation for active work as well. Engaged Buddhism, for example. And I certainly don't think anything is wrong with that. They're doing a lot of, very good work in the world along with their meditative practice. But as I put it here, what concerns me is what seems to be, when it goes too far, a certain prioritizing of social action over meditative practice. So I use the example of a Zen teacher I know in America, Shinzen Young, whose work I greatly respect. Now, Shinzen has been like a tireless advocate and a very, very good teacher of meditation. He doesn't involve himself in active work in the world, but he leads retreats, teaches tirelessly. He says, look, anyone who has done a retreat with me. If you have an issue that comes up in meditation and you feel you need to talk to me about it, call me anytime. 3 a.m. in the morning, I don't care. In fact, I love the 3 a.m. conversations because those problems are really interesting. And yet, I have heard him criticized, I won't say by who. I have heard him criticized because he's not like doing soup kitchen type work. Now, I know, knowing Shinzen, he would never claim that what he's doing is more important than soup kitchen type work. But I think it's very important to realize that it's not less important also. He's really helping people that are genuinely suffering. And he's doing it in a way that not many people can. It's not many people, as I heard it, who was it, Maslow, his order of suffering. If you can't breathe, well, that's a very immediate suffering. But you can solve it very easily by giving someone air. Or, hunger. These are very definite sufferings, but anyone can alleviate those sufferings by providing food, But a deeper form of suffering would be emotional suffering, heartbreak, whatever, disappointment. Those are a little bit harder to address maybe, but spiritual suffering. How many people can really help someone through that kind of suffering? It's a very, very special gift to God, I think. And Shinzen can do it. So I think he should be devoting his time for that special gift that he has. So at any rate, the reason I mention this in a context of a talk on Zen and Christianity is, did I kind of go over this? Let's see. Yeah. The reason I mention this in the context of a talk on Zen and Christianity is that I think many Western Buddhist practitioners feel this need to engage in social activity because of the emphasis in Christian Western cultures on the importance of good works, like caring for the sick, visiting those in prison, so on and so forth. These are mentioned by Christ, of course. But it is important also to remember that those Christian traditions that have a contemplative tradition in the Roman Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox churches, although these traditions do indeed place great value on good works, they also value pure contemplation. So, for example, we have the Carthusians, strictly contemplative life. They have their cell, it's like a little house, actually. A room with a workshop, another one where they can pray, one where they sleep and eat, a garden where they can use as they wish, and they're completely silent, no contact with the other monks except during the daily masses, I think, and they also have, I thought it was one day a month, but I checked, I think it's one day a week when they go out on a long walk. They'd go crazy if they couldn't talk to anybody. I'm sure confession would be another example. But anyway, basically, it is a completely solitary life devoted to pure contemplation. And yet, the Catholic Church regards this as the highest of all vocations of it, with the idea that the prayer of any individual, particularly, the monastics that devote their entire life to the contemplative, the prayer of these people affects not only the person who's praying, but infuses the entire body of the church. So in many ways, the prayer of the Carthusians and the other contemplative orders makes up, it contributes to the life of those active in the world that are often too busy to find much time for prayerful vocation. I also think, to move on to another form, that something else that Christian spirituality has a lot to offer, a lot of insight to offer, is the question of the nature of suffering. This is something that Zen does not specifically talk about. People are driven into the practice by suffering, of course. I've never met a monk particularly one from a lay background who, they may look like very happy, well-adjusted people, and they often are after years and years of practice. But whenever I've asked them, why did you become a monk? Not one of them has said, well, I tried meditation and it just felt so good that I decided I was going to be a monk. It's always been like very, very deep suffering, an inability to find any kind of meaning in life. So it's always suffering that drives us in, but the kind of suffering that arises during, the meditative path is not really addressed in Zen. So, for example, I mentioned, several times people have come to me after a Zen retreat and said something to the effect of, I can't understand it. I've been doing Zazen for years now, yet every time I do a retreat, I find myself feeling depressed for a couple of weeks after it's finished. It's almost as if this idea is that meditation is automatically going to resolve this question of suffering in a kind of a steady upward path. That, of course, I think anyone who's in a vocation knows that's not what happens. You have times of doubt. I think there's several reasons for this. One of them is that it is so easy, particularly nowadays, to distract ourselves from our suffering. SNS, video games, whatever. It is so easy to distract ourselves from suffering that when we do start, for whatever reason, a meditative practice, and we can't distract ourselves, all of the usual confusion that is under the surface, and that we're doing our best to sort of, forget or not become aware of, well, it's going to make itself known to us. And that is the source of, I think, of the early sort of suffering that comes in a meditative practice. But I think Christianity's particular lesson for the suffering in the meditative path is their knowledge and understanding of the dark night of the soul. This much deeper and existential kind of suffering that comes up when you are really progressing in the practice of meditation. When this kind of deeper existential suffering comes up in Zen, you're just told that, look, keep sitting. Don't waste time on that sort of thing. Well, that works for some people, but a lot of people just quit. They can't figure it out. It seems that they failed in their practice. After all, I'm not getting anywhere. And, they end up leaving in a sense of frustration. Because they don't even know about the existence of this dark night of the soul as, a very common stage in the spiritual path. My explanation for this, perhaps it is precisely because the techniques of meditation, the physical side, the sort of meditative psychological side to some extent, have been so highly developed in Zen that Zen hasn't had to examine more closely the nature of the deeper suffering that can arise during practice. The techniques alone are indeed often enough to get a person through the rough spots if that person, he or she, has a natural affinity for the practice. Many, many people do not, as I mentioned a moment ago. Conversely, perhaps because Christianity's meditative techniques are not quite as developed as those in Buddhism, with its history of meditative practice, thousands of years old, precisely because Christianity's meditative techniques, putting emphasis on techniques, are not as developed as those in Buddhism. It may be that Christianity has had to more closely examine the psychology of spiritual suffering and recognize its importance in the purification of the mind. St. John of the Cross likens the purification process to fire burning wood, which starts off with a lot of smoke and crackling. Similarly, the purification process starts with much discomfort for the spirit. But just as wood finally turns to brightly glowing coals, the purified spirit is peaceful and luminous with the light of God. St. John lays out a clear map of this process, which informs the practicer of what to expect on the path of purification and sensitizes him or her to the benefits it brings. Another Christian mystic, this was another one that interested me, and I think it relates even more closely to Zen practice. The author of The Cloud of Unknowing. He says that the deepest form of spiritual suffering is the self-consciousness of its own existence. Now, this is interesting because I think Buddhism from long ago, but modern psychology says, what's the self? Well, it's a thought construct. It's a story. It's a narrative that we tell about ourselves to make sense of who we are and, tell us how to act in the world. It's basically just a conglomeration of ever-changing thought material. So
What the Cloud of Unknowing says relates directly to this. God can well be loved,
but God cannot be thought. God is the unconditioned. Thought is always conditioned. God makes himself known in the present moment because the present moment is free of thought. It's just being, it's presence. So the Cloud of Unknowing God can well be loved, but God cannot be thought. By love, God can be grasped and held. By thought, neither grasped nor held. Thus, in all the mystical traditions, thought is identified as the cause of the subtlest and most profound form of unease or dissatisfaction. Dukkha, in other words, to use the Buddhist term. That thought with which we ordinarily identify so closely cannot approach God is the source of the suffering that is closest to the essence of our spirit. Yet, Christian mystical theology tells us it is this suffering, precisely this suffering, that finally drives us to transcend the limits of thought. The final point I make, well, this is short, so maybe I'll press on. This is something, who was it that pointed this out? Can't quite, maybe it was Dumoulin. He said a number of longtime Zen practitioners who I have, I'm sorry, this is another point that I still wanted to make. There's a little series of books called The Hermit, the Mystic, and the Prophet. Small books that outline, sort of in novel form, the purely contemplative practice that I've lent the series to of Zen practitioners. A number of Zen practitioners who have complained about the suffering they're going through again. A number of longtime Zen practitioners who I have lent Christian books on prayer to, particularly the series I mentioned, have mentioned to me how much these texts help them make sense of the frustration and confusion they were experiencing with the meditation practice. To be forewarned is to be forearmed, as we say. This is as true in spiritual practice as in anything else. The insights of Christianity on the dark side of the soul would be, I think, a valuable addition to the body of knowledge of every serious, Zen practitioner. Okay, the final point, I think it was Dumoulin who pointed out that the Zen people never try to give a subjective description of what the meditative experience is like. What is it like? How does it feel to be like an enlightened person? And he pointed out that Christian mystics are more willing to take a crack at it. And he cites this wonderful passage from Meister Eckhart that I also had read, in the course of my readings. Meister Eckhart compares the kind of joy that this experience involves. Describes it in this way. I have often said that there is something in the soul that is so closely related to God that it is one with God and not just united. Now all things are alike in God and are God himself. Here in this sameness, God finds it so pleasant that he lets his nature and his being flow in this sameness in himself. It is just as enjoyable for him as when someone lets a horse run loose in a meadow that is completely level and smooth. Such is the horse's nature, that it pours itself out with all its might in running about on the meadow. This it would find delightful, such is its nature. So too does God find delight and satisfaction where he finds sameness. He finds it a joy to pour his nature and his being completely into the sameness, for he is the sameness himself. So anyway, as I said, on that upbeat note, probably a good place to end this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kirchner, for your talk. So anyone who wants to question, please feel free to raise your hand. And also our friends on Zoom, feel free to raise your hand. I mean, show your hand screen. So please, go ahead.
I mean, it's important to say that it was pointed out to me that I was misinformed when I said the Carthusian vocation is considered in the Catholic Church to be the highest vocation. Apparently, this is not the case. Priesthood is the highest vocation.
No,
And
no, it's not.
not really.
There is no highest vocation.
There is no highest vocation. Okay. However, it might be the highest monastic vocation. So, yeah,
Images, yes.
just wanted to clarify that.
And I want to look at the question of Zen and ethics from a slightly different angle
Mhm.
than the one that you took. I think that I'm very sympathetic with your position that there's a distinction between meditation and social action.
Mhm.
And you cannot badger people who do meditation into social action,
Mhm.
or the other way around, that they're distinct. And the one, in a sense, can be complete without necessarily involving the other at the same level of intensity. So I agree with you on that. It's not a problem. But at the same time, as long as you see meditation as essential to human fulfillment, not just a pastime for those who can afford it, but something really essential to human fulfillment, and it can't be only for those elite who enjoy the dark night in a psychological and spiritual sense.
Hmm.
So engaging in meditation is a luxury. It's a privilege that the people who live in hunger, in war, in slavery, and in torture can't afford. So we're talking about not just a small minority of people that don't have the opportunity to meditate. We're talking about the masses of humanity. So these people would be happy to have the dark night of the soul if it meant that they weren't tortured or hunger or enslaved or their families torn apart by war. So how does Zen reach these people? Is there any way that the Zen institution, Zen monks, so forth, can reach out to these people? Or are there conditions for the possibility of meditation? In other words, you need a basic level of comfort in life in order to meditate. How about the masses of people who don't have that even fundamental basic level of comfort? Is there anything Zen can say to them, or the Zen as an institution or which it is, because you have robes and monasteries, Tokudo and all those kinds of things. You have hierarchy. Is there anything that can be done in that regard?
Yeah, of course, that's a very complex issue, I think. I think first thing that has to be considered is, yes, of course. I think I mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of suffering. If you can't breathe, nothing else makes any difference because you're going to be dead in 15 minutes. So you have to give them air. And it's only when they have air that they can then say, yeah, but I'm starving. So, well, you have to give them food. And then they're not starving anymore. And it's only when they're not starving anymore, then they can realize, wait a minute, I'm heartbroken and life doesn't mean anything to me. I mean, my stomach is filled and, you know, I have as much water as I need to drink, but why am I so miserable? And that requires a different response. And, you know, your emotional needs are all met. You know, if you have an emotionally stable life, things are going well. And yet, you know, there's this, I mean, people talk about the existential dread. Well, a lot of people would want to dismiss this as a luxury. You've got everything you need. What do you mean? Life is meaningless. It's for some people. And, you know, there is something in them that needs a deeper answer. Those people, I think their suffering is every bit as genuine as people that are, you know, it's a different kind of suffering. But according to Maslow, those lower levels of suffering have to be addressed before the higher levels. This doesn't mean, though, that the higher levels can be ignored. So one way to answer your question is, you know, the contemplative orders, and Zen is the contemplative order of Buddhism. Well, yeah, it is kind of a luxury. These people all have enough to eat. They have enough air to breathe. Generally, the inner suffering they are experiencing is not because they can't find a nice girlfriend. It's something they feel is more profound. And all of those things are not an issue for them, but they still feel like committing suicide because life is meaningless to them. Well, if someone can come along and impart meaning to their life, and in such a way that they not only find meaning and satisfaction, but are able to help others, I think they are, you know, this is in a way on the hierarchy of suffering, I believe, as you put it. But those people, their suffering needs to be addressed too. And this is why I made the point about Shinzen Young. He's one of the people that can offer that and is doing it selflessly and tirelessly, I think. But that's not the only issue. What is meditation? It comes down to that. I think one way to define meditation is a radical acceptance of the reality of the present moment. The present moment is reality. So, for example, one of the problems that actives have in the world is they are trying to address those sort of issues that you just mentioned. People are sick, people are hungry. They go out in the world. They do what they can, but they expect to be thanked for it. And they're not thanked for it often. People resent them. The sick resent. And, you know, a lot of, you know, people that come to Zen meditation, a lot of times they are in the helping professions and they say they burn out. And yet there are the people that never meditate. They never sit down, cross their legs and meditate or, you know, engage in any sort of formal meditative practice. But that kind of burnout does not affect them. They are able to take the resentment and occasional anger and just keep giving and providing. I think those people are every bit as much meditators as, you know, the most dedicated Zen master, if they can, in a spirit of giving and of taking all of the challenges that arise in their meditative lifestyle as opportunities for greater growth as a human being. They are every bit as genuine meditators, I think, as any contemplative.
So basically, there is a kind of base level of comfort of living after which Zen enters, and before which Zen has nothing to say.
Well, if you don't have air to breathe,
Yes.
Zen has nothing to say to you.
Yeah.
If you don't have enough to eat, Zen says, well, if you meditate 3 hours a day, you won't.
No.
Well, they can talk about breatharians.
Yeah, okay.
But leaving that aside, no, of course you have to have enough to eat, and you have to have, and if you've got severe psychological problems, even the Zen masters say, look, you've got to go see a psychiatrist or a therapist, and you've got to work these issues through. If you're hating your parents, or you're not going to make much progress in the meditative path. So yeah, there are certain conditions that have to be met. But at the same time, some people went through the concentration camps and, the various times of history that these things have occurred and come out feeling that they were greatly improved as human beings. So there is an element of, if you can attain that frame of mind, what can I say? The window is much wider for when a sort of meditative state of mind is capable of helping you. You can do it, but you have to be a pretty advanced person already, I think, in that kind of case. Once you have access to the state of mind, it allows you to put up with those challenges in a much more constructive way. I think even faith, I think even belief can become a form of meditation. I know someone, well, actually, it's my older brother who's a fundamentalist Christian. He's a Baptist. And he and his wife, he believes every word in the Bible is exactly, the whole thing, 6,500 years, But anyway, he and his wife were trying to have children. She couldn't conceive. So they took fertility, his wife took fertility drugs, and they end up having twins. And of course, they had to buy a bigger house and put their house on the market, and just then the real estate market in New Haven collapsed. They couldn't sell it, but they had to move to a new house, and they had to go back every weekend and mow all this stuff to keep up and it turned out that one of the twins was blind because they were very premature. She grew up to become a lawyer, by the way. But anyway, it's just one thing after another. It was just unbelievable. And I said to him, Ken, because it didn't seem to bother him at all. And I said, Ken, I don't know how you can put up with this. How did you handle all this? He didn't have a moment of time of his own. And he said, God doesn't make mistakes. The fact that little Jesse is blind, this isn't some mistake that God made. This is exactly the way it's supposed to happen. And my job is just to, look at the reality of the situation and do what I can. So it's kind of the way he's lived his life. And I was thinking, anyways, he's a much better meditator than I am. But when it comes to openly accepting the reality of the present moment. So meditation in the sort of narrow sense of Zen meditation, it's not the only kind of meditative lifestyle.
Okay.
I have some questions online.
Okay.
You can take one of those.
Oh,
It's off the left
yes.
hand.
Any questions?
There's two.
Okay,
Ramona was first.
may I?
Yeah,
What to them
first
first?
one on that, Ramona was first.
Okay. Ramon,
Thank you so much for your very inspiring, very thought-provoking talk. I have a question to do with the possible difficulty that a Westerner might have in getting into the Zen Buddhist mind frame. I understand you didn't come from a position of faith to either Christianity or Zen Buddhist practice. You spoke about grace and the relationship. I think to me, grace is about the relationship between man and God, so man and other power in that sense. Also, you addressed a little bit the question, the difference between meditation and prayer, because to me, prayer is engaging with others, praying for others, praying into the suffering of others. Some people you may not even have met, you may not know. Do you think there's a basic difficulty in the Western approach to Zen Buddhism because of the fact that when Christian prayer enters into this relationship, establishes this relationship between man and God. God is a personal God, a personal divinity, a substantial kind of being. Whereas in Zen Buddhism, the idea is of reducing the self to not, or being one, becoming one with nothingness. So have you ever reflected on this possibility of overcoming from a sort of Christian point of view the notion of the other power as a personal God rather than this notion of nothingness, and whether in meditation, in Zen meditation, I understand, again, I repeat, I understand you didn't come to Zen Buddhist meditation from a position of faith in the Christian tradition, but do you see a way in which this can be mediated or can be sort of dealt with from a comparative point? I'm not sure whether my question is very clear, whether it makes any sense, but it's just to do with this relationship between man and God through grace, and the fact that in meditation you're no longer addressing a personal God or someone who made you in his image, but rather through kenosis, as you said, you're sort of in Zen Buddhist meditation reducing yourself to nothingness. I hope it makes sense. I'm sorry if it doesn't.
Actually, it makes perfect sense. And in fact, I think this is a big issue that people, particularly before they start the practice, this can be an issue. What happened in my case, and I should, before I start, mention that this seems to be very common, and I heard about this explicitly from a Japanese Christian named Sato Mingaku. I don't think he's Catholic. I think he teaches at a Christian university here, but he's another person who has become a recognized Zen teacher. And since he teaches philosophy, I believe, he's very good at German. So he very often goes to Europe and leads Zen meditation in Europe. And one thing he noticed, which I noticed in myself, very quickly, when Westerners who are suffering a crisis of faith, which is one of the things that often drives the practice of meditation, because they want something concrete to do, very often Westerners who are suffering from a crisis in faith in God, that crisis just immediately disappears. The question of, is there a God, which seemed so pressing to them, it's all of a sudden becomes like self-explanatory. It's like it of itself vaporizes. It's like, is there air? What do you mean, is there air? Of course there's air. With meditation, a very different idea of what God might be. More as something far more profound and yet something far more basic to our being. naturally kind of arises. And the whole question of the existence of God becomes meaningless. Of course, you just feel, of course. I mean, why do you even ask that? So that is one possible answer for what you say. I think also Zen meditation, and this again, the effort to force meditative states is very counterproductive and can even be dangerous in a number of ways, but it is the most common mistake I think that we make. In that, well, I'm trying to formulate my ideas here on the run, but the sacrament of the present moment, I think, relies on the feeling that we are completely open to the present moment. We are in no way resisting the present moment. To be in the present moment does not mean to force your mind to think of nothing else than the present and yourself in a little box with no past and no future. Because forcing your mind to do anything always involves tension. Tension is always a form of resistance. So you end up resisting the present moment. And what is the present moment? I mean, what is God's greatest gift to us? God's greatest, well, it's many, many gifts if you're a Christian, but the most immediate gift that God has for us is the present moment. It's the reality in which we live. And true prayer and true meditation, I mean, if someone you love offers you a gift, what is your attitude toward that? Your attitude is, oh, of course, complete openness, complete non-resistance. So when we accept the gift of the present moment, there is no resistance in that. It is so open, it's so unresisting that even the mind movements that usually lead to thoughts of past and future, I mean, we can let them move and just be completely open to their movement in the present moment. You are, through the practice of meditation, I mean, what it basically involves, is steps. You become completely open to the sensations of the body, sensations of the breathing, completely non-resistant and opening. And if you notice you're thinking and going into the past and the future, you just, in a completely open and relaxed way, return to the sensations of the moment. You deepen that by being equally open to but aware of like emotions. What is this emotion trying to teach me in the present moment? How is this affecting me? Deepening that into watching the thought process. But it is a gradual reorientation of the way we live. Generally speaking, the people we meet in life, the situations we meet in life, there's a tendency to want to protect ourselves because life is dangerous. When we evolved in the natural world, there's so many dangers. So our tendency in new and unusual situations is to tighten up and turn away, protect yourself. Meditation is an ever deepening process of learning to open up and turn toward. So open up and turn toward everything that God gave you, your body, your sensations, your emotions, your thoughts, and the reality of the present moment. So these kind of like issues are, they're all involved with resistance, I think. Tension, resistance, not being willing to accept, the reality that is what God is presenting us with. So, does that make sense?
Thank you. No, I realize it's not a conversation we should have on Zoom, but I hope I will meet you in person at some other point and talk about this later. Thanks so much for your answer. Thank you.
This is very physical, and it is a learning to disidentify from thought. So you have to do the practice, and these problems kind of resolve themselves as the practice deepens.
Okay, thank you. There's one more call first. Okay, thank you. Okay, Yusa Sensei, are you there? She's not there.
Okay, tell her, there she is.
I'm trying to find my video. Here I
Okay, oh, hello.
ありがとうございました。Thank you so much. And I'm very inspired by your talk. So I just wanted to say thank you to begin with. And, you know, you brought up many important points, I think, especially for a lady like Ramona, who just asked the question. I understand her question very well. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions and coming even from within Zen people, because it was more convenient to not explain what Zen practice is deep down, so that you know, you just rectify your spine and concentrate on meditation, and it's become more like a battle, you know. But you're saying that you need to relax and your body needs to be flexible and your mind and body needs to become one. And in that moment, something flows through your love, maybe divine love. Grace, you put the word grace, which is very important. And I wanted to comment on that, especially the passage you quoted from Dogen, Shoji. And I think there is much grace in Dogen. And if we take him seriously, Zen is not a military path, you know. And also, Zen is not replacing nothingness or emptiness as God. Zen has its own divinity, divineness. Whatever you choose, you can choose anything, and it can become. Bodhisattva is a good example. You can choose any saint, any spiritual symbol. And I don't think they deny it at all, because, you know, I'm always wondering what Nishida meant by 僕は有神論者だ. I'm a theist. Nishida Kitaro, you know, the Japanese philosopher, said, I'm a theist, not an atheist. Because atheists cannot really philosophize in a full-fledged way. And for example, like Leibniz's God, Pascal's God, Descartes' God, all the philosophers had different God, although they are Christians. In other words, being Christian doesn't mean you're talking about one and the same idea of God. And it seems to me that we are in a way trapped by this notion of God, and we are either afraid of it or we are trapped by it. And it seems to me that that's the other side of what Zen can do, to liberate you from that conceptualization for a while, so that you can return back to your body and your spirit and start to feel again and realize from within, as opposed to what people say from outside. There is something different, no? Listening to birds and all that nature. So it feels to me that what Tom is doing is greatly helpful to modern, postmodern people who are quite lost, I think. And just previously, there was a question from Jim about ethics and so on, and the people who are suffering from war and not having enough. And yet, Shinzen Young's example that Tom mentioned, we need a doctor of the spirit also, not just, you know, kitchen people who can provide you with wonderful soup, which is also necessary, So I just wanted to say a few things like this. I just wanted to thank you for introducing the dimension of grace to this discourse.
Thank you very much, Sensei.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice comment.
Leto as a comment too? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we go to Thorsten.
Yeah, I have some of the same thing in my own words with the grace. I mean, you said that in Zen, then you have no grace because who could give the grace? There is no God. But is it in meditation when you have the emptiness that you talk about, when you make yourself empty and empty? Do you know what will happen then? Meditating is not like solving a mathematical equation that if you do it right, then you get the correct result. No, you do everything right, but if you get the enlightenment or not, that is grace. That is not up to you. So there is something very similar. And then I wonder, we could bring it together with what you said about your brother. Your brother says, everything is determined. Well, then maybe the Zen Buddhists would rather say, no, that was all coincidence.
I don't think
Anything could have happened. There is no grace, but in the end, it's somehow the same, no? It's the same, because whatever happens, you have to accept it anyway.
Okay. I don't know exactly how to address.
I just wanted to know your opinion, if that makes sense to you.
I mean, the emptiness in meditation is, well, there's an old joke I'm sure you've heard that, what is it? Enlightenment is an accident, as you said, but meditation makes you accident prone. You're making yourself more available for the experience, but yeah, there's no guarantee. No, I don't know what sort of experience the Buddha had or Dogen, what these very great Zen masters had. I do think that there are levels of meditation that are accessible to anyone with proper direction. I think contextualization is important. You have to, if you're telling someone to walk to San Francisco, you have to point out that it's west of New York. They're just as likely, if you don't say anything, to head toward Boston or the ocean, So I think people need some kind of direction, and they do have to do an applied practice, but certainly anyone who does a serious meditation practice will come to see a level of mind that is deeper than this level that is completely defined by our thought construct, which is the ego. And that alone can be quite transformative. You can see a level of mind that is deeper than the level of thought and see how thoughts arise out of this. Now, that alone is a state of tremendous it's clarity and energy, and but it's a state of complete letting go. And where that will eventually lead to, I have a scientific explanation, which is probably complete nonsense. But one time I was giving a talk about the Buddhist idea, basic Buddhist ideas like non-self and non-permanence, impermanence. And I was saying, well, the idea of impermanence in Buddhism, we have this idea of, Tom, don't get too attached to your little watch because, eventually it's going to break. Nothing lasts forever. I mean, that idea of impermanence does, of course, exist in Buddhism. This too shall pass away. But more specifically, in in Mahayana Buddhism, this idea that nothing is in an unchanging state for even the briefest instant of time. This is what impermanence really means as far as Mahayana Buddhism is concerned. So after I gave this talk, an old gentleman came up to me and he said, I'm a retired quantum physicist. And I found that idea of Buddhist impermanence to be very interesting because in modern physics, we study subatomic particles and they're very, very hard to study because they're never actually there. They're always winking, an electron is always winking in and out of existence. So all we could do is make an educated guess about them. And he said, when you think about it, he said, we physicists, I don't know if all physicists agree with him on this. I've heard later, not all of them do, but he said, we have come to the point where it is hard to conceptualize the universe being the way it is without positing the existence of an underlying consciousness. Because the world, in effect, if all of the subatomic particles are constantly winking in and out of existence, the act of creation, according to modern physics, is going on in each and every moment of time right now. The world is being created anew. And I've often wondered, why is it that merely being in the present moment? I mean, sports people talk about this. These are not monk types. They talk about being willing to risk their life, literally, to be in the present moment, climbing a cliff or surfing a 60-foot wave. Why is there this inherent joy in being in the present moment that is much deepened in meditation? There is that clarity, there's a great joy in it. And it struck me that if you are 100% in the present moment, completely open to and unresisting the present moment, in a very real way, you are approaching the act of creation, which is always going on in the present moment. And, can we eventually reconnect with that? Actually, if you get deeper enough, maybe that's what, a really profound enlightenment is. A felt experience of the act of creation, of connection with the creative consciousness. Anyway, that's just an idea I have, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question. Paul Swanson, please, Swanson Sensei. Swanson Sensei, are you there?
Take a sec, probably to turn his microphone off.
Turn on his mic.
Just hold on.
Yes, is there time?
Yes.
Thank you so much. So many good memories of when we were working together so many years at Nanzan. I just wanted to add one comment on the idea of grace, because I found it intriguing how you talked about how that's something maybe lacking in Zen Buddhism, but it's certainly, as you know, not lacking in Buddhism as a whole. And even not talking about Pure Land Buddhism, but in Tendai, that's one of the basic structures is the idea of Kanno, Kang and O of Kang is the capacity or empathy or ability of the sentient being, and O is the response of the Buddha, whatever the Buddha is, but there's a response, and there's a synergy between the capacity of the human being and the response of, what the Buddhists call the Buddha. And that together brings you on the path of the Buddha. So, I think I've often attempted to translate this as grace. I know there are Japanese Buddhist scholars who say, no, this isn't grace, that's too Christian. But, what you said today, I think shows that the idea of grace is really one that's also very important in Buddhism. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tao. I think I'm so sorry, but I have to say, the time is, and so we have to close this meeting. And once again, I appreciate really coming and for your giving your talk, which comes from your long experience and your deep meditation. Thank you so much, and we keep contact with each other. Thank you so much. Many thanks to our friend on Zoom. Thanks so much for your participation. Thank you.